Good morning, everybody. It is great to see you all here today. Thank you, Carl, for leading that very appropriate song. I appreciate that. Want to welcome our guests who are joining us this morning. We're very glad that you're here, and hopefully you can stick around a little bit after service and let us get to know you a little bit. We also want to welcome those who are joining us online. We're grateful that you are here as well. Leave us a comment down below or message us there in the live chat, and we'd love to get to know you those ways as well. You know, we live in a world that is full of bad news. Seems like anytime you turn on the TV, something else has gone wrong. But this week, some exciting news came out. For those of you who follow space news, you probably already know, but the James Webb Space Telescope launched late last year, and this week they finished all the tests and calibrations, and the first images have finally come in, and they are just spectacular. What the, now I forget what the name of the last one was, Hubble. The Hubble telescope did, amazing things for us years and years ago, and now this amazing piece of technology and ingenuity is out there and taking pictures of the night sky. I think for as long as humans have been alive, we've looked up to the heavens and we've wondered what's up there. What is beyond our galaxy? What's beyond our stars? These are just a couple of the images that have come in, and so many more are going to be coming in over the next couple of weeks and months and years, and we look forward to those discoveries. Like the Hubble, they took a grain of sand, or they took a picture of a grain of sand held out at arm's length, and they took a picture, and they came up with all these galaxies, right over here, all these galaxies that are just in that little tiny space in the night sky. The heavens truly do declare the glory of God. And it sets off our imagination. It sets off our wonder of what our world is like and why we are the way that we are. It puts things in perspective. And it makes us wonder what the world could be like. And it's because of the dreaming through maybe the night sky that sci-fi things like Star Trek make us question what the world could be like. Or things like Star Wars that make us wonder why our world is the way that it is. The Star Trek franchise has been going for many, many years. The first three movies, episodes 4, 5, and 6, came out in the early 1980s. Just to kind of put things into perspective. They finally released episodes 1, 2, and 3 because, that's always the way you do things in the early 2000s, and then they finally have kind of continued to expand the universe with episodes 7, 8, and 9 here recently. But you don't have to be a Star Trek nerd to appreciate the stars, nor do you have to be a Star Wars nerd in order to appreciate the impact that Star Wars has had upon pop culture and the movie industry as a whole. Right? It's a very familiar story, isn't it? You have a galactic republic that has a lot of boring politics and some sad side quests, and then that gives birth to the evil galactic empire, right, that has to be overcome. And it's not long into the series that you find the rebels coming out and fighting against evil and trying to overcome evil Constantine's attempt at rule and all of his schemes. Of course, you have to defeat the enemy before another planet-destroying space laser strikes again, right? But it's things like this, and there's many other things within our culture that elevates this concept of the rebel. It's ingrained within our society. This idea of those who are fighting against the system. It really elevates this idea of the rebel. But this morning I want us to kind of wrestle with the question, what would God have us do? Would God have us to be rebels? Would God call us to act in that way? I mean, obviously, those who are fighting against the evil galactic empire are in the right, but the question we have to ask ourselves is that what we should be doing? Right? Is that what God is calling us to do? I believe we find the answer, or we begin to find the answer as we continue our journey with Israel through the desert. God has called Moses to lead the people of Israel, and he has done so faithfully since they have brought them out of Egypt. They brought them through the desert, brought them through the sea, brought them to Mount Sinai. They spent a year at Mount Sinai. God has given them the law. God has shown himself to be strong. He has allowed them to learn through examples, through living life. He has given them the law. He has laid it out in very strong detail, how they ought to live, who they ought to be. And you would think that after all these things, as God now calls them to leave Mount Sinai, that Israel would be reformed, that their rebellious ways would be at an end. So is Israel finally redeemed? Is Israel finally restored? Or are they finally figured out that they can trust God, that His ways are better than our ways? I mean, He's right there on the mountain, and they built this amazing tabernacle, and they've received the law. So are they finally redeemed? Are they finally obedient followers of God? Well, God says it's time to leave. The cloud picks up over the tabernacle and moves to the edge of camp. They pack everything up. Everyone files in line. Everything seems to be going well. They go out into the desert. And what happens? They begin to complain again. And it's not even new complaints. It's old complaints. We don't have any meat. We're hungry. And they begin to think about Egypt. Oh, we had melons in Egypt, and we had fish in abundance, and oh, I'd just go back and be a slave in order to have those things again. We've only gone through 2 chapters now, Numbers 10 and 11, and we've already seen that Israel is having a difficult time learning these simple lessons. But it provides us an opportunity to learn some important lessons. Even here, we already find some important lessons. Israel has God right there with them. They have God leading them, providing for them. But when we are following God and He is right there and He is leading us, it doesn't remove the hot desert sun, does it? There's still the difficulties of life. We live in a fallen world. There's challenges around us. There's challenges for us to live through. Israel struggles to trust God and to be content with God right there, providing them every meal that they get. They have a hard time trusting God and being content. And this teaches us something about trusting God and being content. See, our contentment is not based upon our situation. Right? Our contentment is not based upon our situation. Israel didn't have any magazines. They didn't have any targeted ads. There was no stores anywhere nearby, and Israel was still not content. You cannot blame your discontentment upon our culture. You cannot blame your discontentment upon all the things that you're seeing and what your neighbors got and saying, oh, but I want that. Israel didn't have neighbors. They didn't have all those things around them, and they still found themselves not being content. See, contentment is not based upon our circumstances. It's based upon our trust and our faith in God. And it's also worth noting that our faith and our trust in God is not dependent upon being able to see Him present or knowing that He's leading us. Because God is right there. God is physically leading them. He is physically taking care of them every day that they go out and pick up manna. And they're still complaining, and they're still not trusting God. Trusting God comes down to knowing Him. Knowing who He is, that He actually has our best interest at heart. And Israel hasn't learned these lessons. And we struggle to learn these lessons as well. Paul talks about this. He reflects upon learning this lesson in Philippians chapter 4. In Philippians chapter 4, starting in verse 11, Paul says, I'm not speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am in to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and in hunger and abundance and in need. I can do all things through Him who strengthens me. Paul knows what it's like to be content. He knows what it's like to have plenty. He was the up-and-coming star under Gamaliel. He knows what it's like to be taken care of by his community, whether we're talking about the Jewish community before his conversion or the Christian community after his conversion. Paul knows what it's like to be blessed. But Paul also knows what it's like to face hardships and trials. He has been stoned. He has been beaten. He has been shipwrecked. He has been in prison. He has faced times of hunger. He has been in danger. And that's the short list. And most of that for the sake of the gospel. And Paul says, despite my situation, I have learned the secret of being content. I have learned the secret of being content. What is it, Paul? Faith in God. Knowing that I can do all things through Him. Knowing that He's the one who's taking care of me, that He's the one who's providing for me, that I rest on Him, that He's in control. Now, this is not to say, in any way, shape, or form, that we don't have a responsibility in dealing with our needs. We are called to bear our own burdens, but we're also called to bear each other's burdens, to be there to seek help from one another. So we should be seeking to bear our responsibilities and seek to take care of our needs. This isn't to say that we don't have needs. We do, right? Food is a need. Water is a need. And Israel has asked God for those things in the past when they didn't have them. But they didn't learn that God did provide in time for those needs. But we live in a fallen world. There are times in this world where we will go without our needs being met, whatever those might be. But we still serve a God who cares for us, who looks after us, and who will take care of us. Whether we're going through the difficulties of a desert or whether we're going through the difficulties of an economic period that is difficult and challenging, we have to learn to be content. We have to learn to trust God, that He cares for us, that He will provide for us. We have to come to know who He truly is, and we do that through a study of His Word, through examples like the Exodus that show us that God cares. And people who fail to learn those life lessons that are there to be learned. There's also an important lesson here to learn about the consequences of not trusting. By Israel not trusting God, they're stealing their joy. Their lack of contentment, their lack of trusting God steals their joy in these moments. It's also worth noting that it frustrates and saddens God. It saddens God to see them continue to not trust Him, to continue to rebel against Him. And it also discourages the leadership. Look over in Numbers chapter 11, starting in verse 16. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Gather for me 70 men of the elders of Israel, whom you know to be elders of the people and officers over them. Bring them to the tent of meeting, and let them take their stand there with you. I will come down and talk with you there, and I will take some of the Spirit that is on you and put it on them, and they shall bear the burden of the people with you, so that you may not bear it yourself alone." The constant griping, the constant questioning by the people has worn Moses down. He cries out to God. He's like, "Why are you doing this to me? Why have you put me in this position? The people are just a hard, stiff-necked people. They're not going to listen." And Moses gets to a breaking point, and God's finally like, "All right, call 70 of the elders. Bring them down. I'm going to give them additional responsibility, additional leadership role." I've said it before, and it's worth repeating here again. Many hands make light work. That's true whether we're talking about an event like the clothing giveaway or the coat giveaway, when we're doing something physical, whether that's the lead up to it or whether that's the day of. But it's also true in the spiritual form. Our elders and our deacons need help. I think I can speak for our elders on this point. I think we're all in agreement, but I will definitely speak for myself. We need more elders. We need more deacons. We have 3 amazing elders. We have 2 amazing deacons. I love these guys. But they can't do it alone. They need help. We have to rise to that occasion. We have to be seeking to put things in our life in place so that we can take on those responsibilities that God has given to us. All right, I'll get off my soapbox for a moment. So has Israel learned their lesson? Right? God has provided them meat. He's dealt with them. He's been compassionate to them. Have they learned their lesson? No. No. The very next chapter, it's Miriam and Aaron who are rebelling against Moses. His own brother and sister, his co-leaders, those who are right there with him, they find themselves being jealous of Moses and rebelling against him, saying, I want a position of power. I want a responsibility. God very clearly answers this question. He very clearly says, Moses is the one that I called. Moses is the one that I'm working through right now. Don't rebel against my leadership. Don't rebel against him. It's very clear. And God sets the people straight until they get to the land of Canaan. And they get to the edge of the land of Canaan, and God says, all right, select 12 men among you. Go in and spy out the land. Go see what it's like. You've been questioning whether or not I'm going to provide for you in abundance. Go in and look at the land. So 12 spies go in and they search out the land. They come back. They find out that the land is good and abundant. But we also find out something else. As the children's song says, there were 12 spies who spied on Canaan. 10 were bad and 2 were good. What did they see when they spied on Canaan? Some saw giants big and tall. And some saw God rule over all. Right? Those 10, who all they could see was the obstacle in front of them, who still had not learned the lesson to trust God and to do what He had called them to, worried for their children, and worked up the whole crowd, the whole community, into yet another rebellion. In Numbers chapter 14, 1 through 4, we read, the whole congregation raised a loud cry, and the people wept that night. And all the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The whole congregation said to them, would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or that we had died in the wilderness. Why did God bring us to this land to fall by the sword, or our wives and our little ones to become prey? Would it be better for us to go back to Egypt? And they said to one another, let us choose leaders and go back to Egypt. Wow. Wow. Back to Egypt. Rebelling against God's leadership, rebelling against God yet again. It's worth noting the result of this rebellion. God's frustrated with the people, understandably. But God relents in the moment. And we read this as we get down to verse 20. Then the Lord said, I have pardoned according to your word, but truly as I live, and as all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord, none of the men who have seen my glory and my signs that I did in Egypt, in the wilderness, and yet have put me to the test these 10 times, and have not obeyed my voice, shall see the land that I swore to give their fathers, and none of those who despised me shall see it. God is merciful in that moment. But there is a consequence to their rebellion. There's a consequence to their lack of faith. 40 years of wandering. A 40-year pause on God's plan while a generation dies out. A generation that worried that the path before them was too difficult for their children, was too challenging for those in their care, would now have to be the ones who bear the responsibility for that work. Think about that for a moment. A generation that was scared to take on the work that God had given them because of their children would now leave that same work and that responsibility to their children to carry on. While a generation passed away. A generation that continued to be a stiff-necked and stubborn people who refused to learn the lesson to trust God, that He had their best interest at heart, that whatever God asked them to do, they could do. And they still didn't learn their lesson. When they realized that they were going to have to wander in the desert and they realized the sin that they've done, guess what they do? They try to go take the land. God says, I'm not going to be with you. They say, we're going to take the land. And they get beat. They have to go back into the desert. And they still don't learn their lesson. Number 16, Korah's rebellion. Once again, the people rebel against Moses. Once again, they rebel against God. God could be no clearer as the earth swallows the whole rebellious group up. The earth opens up and eats them. Right? It's an amazing story. God is clear. Do not rebel against my anointed. We live in a culture that glorifies rebellion. We live in a culture that glorifies it. But our God calls us to be something very, very different. Now, some might say, well, but Michael, that was against Moses. That was against God himself leading. That was against righteous people, and they were a rebellious people. But God calls us to righteousness. God calls us to live differently from the world. Do these principles really apply to us today? Well, the Bible is very clear about the complexity and the difficulties of our world. The Bible addresses all of these things, but the principles still stand. And if you question that, go over to Romans chapter 13. Paul, writing to the church in Rome, says, "Let every person be subjected to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, which those who have existed have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to do good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. If you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out the wrath of God upon wrongdoers. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of your conscience. Because of this, you also pay taxes. For the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed them. If taxes, to whom taxes are owed. Revenue, to whom revenue is owed. Respect, to whom respect is owed. Honor, to whom honor is owed." Do not forget who Paul is speaking to here. He's speaking to people who live under the evil Roman Empire. He is speaking to people who are living under evil emperors like Nero, a state that is often opposed to the righteousness of God and opposed to the message of Christianity. Paul says God put them in power. God is the one who has established them, and to rebel against them is to rebel against God. I don't know how much more clear Paul can be. But we as Christians do wrestle with a question. The early church wrestled with a question. How can I submit to a government that calls me to say Caesar is Lord when Jesus is Lord? How can I submit to a government that allows their children to be left and abandoned in the trash heap to die of exposure when God calls us to value life? How can I submit to a government that sees my very existence as rebellion, my very faith as opposed to them? And yet, the early church did. And they won over the Roman government and that culture through love, through submission. And that's so counter to our world. We say we should rebel, we should be an object of change. And God calls us to be an object of change, but not in the way that the world does. Look at the example that the apostles leave us in Acts chapter 4. Starting in verse 18. So they called them, and they charged them not to speak or to teach at all in the name of Jesus. But Peter and John answered them, whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you whatever is right in the sight of God to listen to you rather than to God, you must judge. For we cannot speak but what we have seen and what we have heard. The apostles were on trial for submitting or for preaching the gospel. The apostles were on trial for preaching the gospel. And the leadership brought them in and said, you cannot do this. Look at what the apostles did. They held firm. They didn't back down from the truth. They said, "Here we stand, we can do no other." But they also did so in a respectful way and in a submissive way. Whatever punishment comes, it comes. But we cannot help but do what God has called us to do. God calls us to submit to our government as far as we can. To whatever point that we can until we begin to violate the law of God. And at that point, we respectfully hold our ground and say, "Here's as far as I can go, I can do no other." And we see that again and again and again in early church history as the church sought to do this, as the church stood up for their right, or for the gospel. They lost their position within the marketplace because they wouldn't take a little pinch of incense to whatever God was over that market. They wouldn't say Caesar is Lord because only God is Lord. And we in the 21st century look back on that and say, yeah, but it's just a little bit of incense. Why are you going to lose your livelihood over this? It's just words. We know Caesar isn't Lord. Just say it to get them out of your hair. But they refused, respectfully refused. They were seen as rebels, but they didn't seek to overthrow their government. They gladly accepted the persecution, the taking of their property. They chose to be salt and light by taking on responsibilities that were not theirs, by taking in these children who were abandoned and taking care of them and making them their own. This is the example that the early church leaves us. And through their submission and through their love, they turn the world upside down. They turn the world upside down. Our culture glorifies rebellion. It's deeply ingrained within us. And we wrestle with this. How do we stay true to the things of God and submit to a worldly government? How do we follow God faithfully? How do we find contentment in this world and trust Him and yet exist in this world? And that's exactly what God calls us to. He calls us to walk this complex path, these difficulties, to challenge us to live through these, to figure out how to stand up for what's right, to do so in the right way. Israel had to learn this. They had to learn to trust God. They had to learn to follow God. They had to learn how to navigate the difficulties of submitting to God and not rebelling. And this wasn't only something they had to learn under a godly government like Moses or Joshua. This is also something they had to learn all the way in Babylon, in Assyria. God says, don't rebel against them. Thrive where you're planted. I will call you back in time. We see this again and again and again. The question is, will we trust God? Will we trust that He is the one in control? That's the question. Do we trust God to take care of us? Will we be content? Will we trust God in the leadership that is over us? Or will we not, and will we rebel? That's really the question. Do we trust God, that He is at work? When I was in upstate New York working with a group of college kids, I fell into a group of people who were conspiratorial minded. They liked to think about the Illuminati and other entities behind the scenes pulling the strings of our government. And I kind of argued with them a little bit, but I said, okay. Even if you're right, the Word of God here on this point is very clear. It doesn't matter who elects our government in the end, doesn't it? Ultimately, God's the one who puts them in control. God's the one who establishes them. I don't care. I think you're crazy, but I don't care because God's the one who establishes them. And our path and how we are to live our lives is clear. It's clear. We live out our faith. We're a community. We help each other through these things. We wrestle with how far can we go? And when we can go no further, we wrestle with how do we stand firm and do so in a respectful way that is a light to our community. It's a challenge. It's a challenge. But the Word of God is clear. What He calls us to is clear. It's very clear. So for those of you who are Christians, the question is, how will you be the salt and the light in our community this week and next week and the week after? How will you live out your faith? Maybe you're struggling with that and you need encouragement. You need to talk to the elders. You need to figure out what the path forward looks like, and you need that counsel. That's what we're here for. So here in a minute when we stand and sing, you can come and let those needs be known, or anytime throughout the week you can reach out to us and let us know, and we'd love to talk with you. Or maybe you're not yet a Christian. And as you've studied this book, it intrigues you and you find yourself believing, yes, there is a God, and yes, I want to trust Him, yes, I want to know Him, but you still have questions. We'd love to study with you. Maybe you have been studying this book and you know what it means to die to yourself, to surrender in the watery grave of baptism, and to be made new. We can do that this morning as well.